They stalk dark forests and dark alleyways. They howl at the moon and are believed to be sworn enemies of vampires. Let's talk about werewolves. Hello everyone, Funky Monkey here, and welcome to today's episode. Since it's still November, let us continue our journey through the history of creatures that have haunted humanity's nightmares for millennia. As a disclaimer, today's episode will include some very graphic details, as unfortunately they are necessary for us to paint as an accurate picture as we can. That, and because I am of the strong belief that history and myths and legends should not have filters or should not be changed as we please, I will be giving you some very graphic details regarding the habits and actions of werewolves as they've been passed down throughout history. Just to be crystal clear, I do not believe in werewolves, nor do I believe in vampires or any other supernatural creatures. I am treating these stories as simple myths, simple bedtime stories to scare the living shit out of children. The purpose for me making these videos is for us to understand where all of these myths come from and why people came up with such gruesome stories and details and creatures. So, if you don't like hearing stories about creatures that hunted humanity for millennia and their mostly eating habits, this is probably the best moment for you to click away. I won't hold it against you, as I don't really like these details either, but if you stick around, I will assume you knew what you were getting yourself into. Now, where do they come from? Why they came into being, and why are they here? Before we dive into our story, let us talk about the miniature I will be painting today. Although I don't actually have a werewolf to paint because the store I buy my miniatures from hasn't replenished their miniature stock in quite a while, I tried to find something in my pile of shame, my collection of unpainted minis, something that is at least thematic, something that is at least in the ballpark. So today I will be painting a night hag from WizKids. This miniature has been in my pile of shame for at least 2 years, and I think this is the perfect moment to dust it off and actually paint it. Now, before we start our dive through the history of werewolves, let me tell you what I plan on doing with this miniature. After base coating with Abaddon Black and Zenithal priming with Ceramite White, my plan is to paint the hag's robe red, with a yellow shawl, Incubi dark shirt, paint her skin purple and give her black and green hair. I will divide the miniature initially in segments and apply all the base colors for each segment, moving from segment to segment while the previous ones are drying. With my plans for the miniature laid out before you, I think it is time we start talking about werewolves. If you don't know what a werewolf is, well, it's quite simple. They are human beings that turn at night into wolves or wolf-like creatures. This might happen of their own volition, learning to control the transformation, or it could happen independent of their will, as it happens in the case of people who were bitten by another werewolf, or those who inherit this ability or affliction, depending on how you want to call it. Werewolves have found a very comfortable place in pop culture, in works of fiction, in video games, TTRPGs, even commercials. There are also many representations and interpretations of this affliction, but there are some core elements that usually don't change regardless of how you integrate a werewolf in your creative work. They are much stronger than humans, they have very keen senses just like wolves, they howl, they can transfer this affliction or werewolvelism, it's not an actual word but you get the point, through bites. They are not in full control of themselves when they are in their wolf form, And if they are injured while in wolf form, the injury is also present when they are back in human form. They turn under the full moon, or in some cases, in some cultures, if they are the seventh son in a family that has only sons, automatically they are werewolves. Now, I don't know how that works, but sure, it is something that people used to believe. And there are cultures that believe werewolves upon death return as vampires, while other cultures believe that the nemesis of vampires are werewolves. Regardless of these beliefs, they are make-believe stories created to scare the living crap out of the audience and most likely children, or were created to explain creepy and mysterious occurrences. The oldest mention of werewolves comes from the Epic of Gilgamesh from the Sumerians around 2100 BCE. In this epic, King Gilgamesh rejects the goddess Ishtar, goddess of love and fertility, because he is afraid of her. Legend has it that she turned a previous lover into a wolf, and he wants to avoid becoming a werewolf, basically. There are no other surviving stories from that far back in history, and as opposed to gods that are vampires, such as the ancient Egyptian goddess Sekhmet, if you don't know what I'm talking about, make sure you check out my previous video on vampires. There are no actual werewolf gods, or at least I couldn't find any. In order to find more recent stories, we have to come closer to our time until we reach the Greek and Roman world. There are two main stories that relate to werewolves in ancient Greek culture, and both are connected to a place in Greece, Arcadia. One of these stories talks about a mythological king, Lycaon, and set in motion the imagination of the audience and humanity in general, giving the opportunity of spin-offs being created regarding this king, while the other story revolves around a particular place, Mount Lycaon or Wolf Mountain, the tallest peak in Arcadia and the place that shocked the ancient Greeks. We'll be talking about both because they are quite relevant when it comes to the origin of werewolves. Now, because I'm going to start telling a story, I made sure I have coffee in my mug and I have some very tasty tea in my mousse cup. And let us get comfortable and start our stories. King Lycaon, son of Pelasgus, husband of Silene, a nymph. So right off the bat, we are deep in mythology and in fantasy. The core legend mentions that King Lycaon organized a grand feast for the gods with the occasion of the inauguration of Lycaea, an ancient festival. Lycaon, for some reason, decided to test the gods and prepared a meal for them out of human flesh. When it comes to this meal, there are two versions of the legend. First has the king murdering his youngest son, Nyctimus, while the other has him murdering his grandson, Arcas. Both of them, regardless of who he murders, mentions that he prepared the meal out of them and served it to the gods. Angered at this profanity, Zeus flipped the table and sent lightning bolts on Lycaon's household, killing both him and all of his sons. Legend has it he had around 50 sons. The second legend, that regarding the mountain, comes from Greek and Roman sources. What the ancients tell us is that each year, at the start of the festival of Lycaea, so a connection to King Lycaon, People would go up Lycaon mountain and take part in an initiation ritual. It was a rite of passage that involved young men coming of age. From what we gather, it was a nocturnal ritual as explained by the name Nictimus, again a connection to King Lycaon. Nictimus derives from the ancient Greek word for night, nix. It was carried out by a particular clan that each year went up the mountain and sacrificed a male child. A morsel of flesh or of entrail would be mixed in a dish with chunks of animal meat, and those that participated in the ritual would all take a random chunk from the dish, and the one who had the fortune of getting the human flesh morsel would turn into a wolf for 9 years. The only way they could turn back into a human was that if for 9 years while in wolf form they didn't taste human flesh or human blood. On this mountain, multiple altars dedicated to Zeus were seen and still can be identified by archaeologists. And according to legend, there was also an area where no human was allowed to step foot in. In this area, apparently, the ancients believed that the cave where Zeus was born could be found. Anyone who entered that particular area had to be sacrificed. Now, let's take a moment, go to the mini, but before we do so, if you reached this far into the video, make sure you hit that like button as it tremendously helps this channel grow. Let's go see how I'm doing with the mini. After applying 2 coats of corn red to make sure that the robe is properly painted, I am using Karaborg Crimson to add shadows to the robe and targeting the folds of the cloth especially. While the crimson is drying, I am moving to the shawl and using Ethereal Yellow, I am adding highlights, trying to make it seem like the cloth is softly catching the light. This is not particularly easy as cloth is not usually very reflective, and I'm trying to make it seem as natural as possible, but it's getting there. Welcome back. As I've mentioned before we took the break, there are many legends that were derived from the original legend regarding King Lycaon. One of the most famous ones comes from the ancient author Ovid. The legend has it that Zeus took the form of a lowly peasant and traveled to Arcadia. Upon reaching Arcadia, he started showing signs of his divine origin. Unconvinced, King Lycaon invited this peasant to his stable and wanted to test if it was actually Zeus. To do so, he murdered a prisoner and prepared a meal out of his flesh and entrails and served it to Zeus. After doing so, he invited Zeus to spend the night in his household. To further test his guest's divinity, he decided to try and murder Zeus in his sleep. Of course, Zeus, as you might imagine, was really pissed and brought the roof down and turned Lycaon as a punishment into a wolf. Another legend, no less famous, comes from the ancient Greek author Pausanias, who tells us that King Lycaon was punished by Zeus by being turned into a wolf because he sacrificed a child on an altar of Zeus and sprinkled that child's blood around the altar. This creates a connection between King Lycaon and Mount Lycaon. In the 3rd century BCE, the ancient Greek author and philosopher Lycophron passes down a legend saying that King Lycaon and his 50 children from several women were all punished and transformed into wolves by Zeus because they murdered and consumed their youngest brother Nictimus. Again, creating a link between the ancient festival of Lycaea, that was a ritual performed during the night, Nyctimus, Nyx, you see the connection. But there's an additional detail that Lycophron gives us, that this punishment extended to all Arcadians. So all of the subjects of King Lycaon were also punished. To be fair, all of these legends can easily make their way into a fantasy setting with a few tweaks. Having a whole group of people, a whole population being punished by the gods because of a common sin against morality is an interesting plot, an interesting story. But to be honest, I perhaps would leave out the cannibalistic side of it, or at least I would imply it, not outright say it, and be it something that the denizens, those that have been punished, are reluctant to talk about because it is something that their ancestors did and they still have to pay for it, or something to that effect. Now, besides King Lycaon, we also have another famous werewolf from ancient Greece, but this story is more tightly connected to that of the rituals on the mountain. The famous werewolf was called Damarcus, and he was a famous ancient Greek boxer. During the festival of Lycaea, a child was sacrificed and his flesh was consumed by Damarcus. Zeus was horrified of this horrendous sin and punished the cannibal by turning him into a wolf. As previously mentioned, the only way to revert back to human form was for the sinner to abstain from tasting blood or flesh of humans for 9 years while in wolf form. Legend has it that Damarcus actually managed to do so and reverted back to his human form. There are several other authors who take this whole story and tweak it just a little bit to make it their own, and these authors say that no, this story is not accurate because the sinner had to abstain from eating human flesh for 10 years and not 9. Huge difference. At the same time, Pausanias does not agree with any part of this story except one. He investigated this whole story and came to the conclusion that Damarcus was indeed a famous Greek boxer, but on his funerary stone there are no mentions of him turning into a werewolf for 9 years. As you can see, investigative journalism has very old, ancient and strong roots. With that being said, we are done with that part of the story, with those legends about Lycaon and Damarcus. Let's turn attention to the mountain. There is an ancient source from the 4th century, an ancient author and philosopher by the name Theophrastus, who mentions that the child sacrifices that were carried out on Lycaon mountain in Arcadia were similar to those carried out by the Carthaginians in honor of Moloch or Baal, their chief deity, a god of weather and agriculture. For the Greeks, to have cannibals in their midst was a horrifying thought. They prided themselves with being an advanced culture, inventing mathematics and philosophy and studying the sciences at that time, being the birthplace of a new form of government, resisting many invasions and attacks and pushing back against the Persians who were considered to be barbarians. For them to have cannibals in their midst was a nightmarish prospect. Over the past several decades, archaeologists started really investigating Mount Lycaon. They unearthed multiple ash pile altars dedicated to Zeus. While analyzing the remains of these burnt offerings, no human remains were actually identified, but in one particular area, a skeleton has been unearthed, that of a teenage boy. Although this is not irrefutable evidence that child sacrifices were indeed carried out on Mount Lycaon, the fact that this skeleton was found in a sacred area with no cemeteries around does present some evidence that it might have been a ritual sacrifice. What the archaeologists did uncover was the fact that the mountain was used for rituals long before the Greeks actually started venerating Zeus. On the mountain, there were burnt offerings found dating back to the 3rd millennia BCE, so around 3000 BCE. Oh, one last mention of werewolves comes from the ancient historian and geographer Herodotus, who mentions that far up north, beyond the territories occupied by the Scythians, a tribe of people called the Neuri would change into wolves 7 days per year and hunt in this form. To what ends? We don't know, but Herodotus does make a point of underlying the fact that he does not believe this story. When it comes to the Romans, they didn't have a lot of stories and legends about werewolves. They prefer to take those created by the Greeks and retell them. But if you think about it, the idea of werewolves, of a wolf-human hybrid, was deeply ingrained in their collective consciousness. Let me explain. Their founding myth, the story of Romulus and Remus, is basically that of werewolves. They are two orphaned children who are suckled and nursed and cared for by a she-wolf for quite a significant period of their life. From a certain point onward, they are found by a shepherd, and alongside his wife, they raise the children among humans. Thus, we have human-wolf hybrids. There is a theory that promotes the idea that the shepherd's wife was a prostitute, or as the ancient Romans would call them, a lupa, a she-wolf. But again, this is a theory, and I think I kind of like the werewolf version more, just for the novelty of it. At one point we will discuss the founding myth of the Roman people, but you already know the drill, it's another story for another time. And with that, I think this is a perfect moment to take another look at the miniature before we continue our journey. Once again, I find myself working on the shawl. Using Arial Yellow, I am trying to add even more highlights, trying to catch only the raised areas, the tops of creases, and the shoulders. I am trying to apply the lightest of touches using my thinnest brush and a very watered down paint, as the shawl is almost done and I am only trying to make it seem more natural. It doesn't seem to work that well. Welcome back. Let us now move closer to our time and further north geographically. The Norse culture has amazing stories and myths and legends that were passed down to us through epics and sagas. Of course, one of these sagas that mention werewolves is Beowulf, but we're not going to be talking about that one because we have something closer to Dungeons and Dragons and TTRPGs and other fantasy settings in general. And it's gonna be a cool segue for a future video that I will make. We have the Volsunga saga that mentions a group of warriors, the Wolfhednar. They were considered to be werewolves. They were believed to be Odin's elite warriors. They would always wear wolf pelts and be armed with spears. They were said to never don armor when engaging in battle and always only rely on their skill and their ferocity. They were akin to berserkers. One of the differences between the two groups of warriors was that berserkers were associated with the bear, while the Wolfhednar were associated with the wolf. Both warrior groups had, according to legend, superpowers. But among the two, the Wolfhednar were the better warriors. They were Odin's elite soldiers. So think about that. Everybody heard of berserkers, but I don't know how many of you heard of the Ulfhegnar. To be honest, I hadn't before doing research for this video. Much like the berserkers, the Ulfhednar lived on the edge of society because they were considered to be a threat even to their communities. They acted like madmen, they acted like rabid dogs and wolves, howling, growling and biting at people. When engaging in battle, they were believed to actually turn into legendary beasts, mythical creatures, werewolves. They were feared and revered, but still kept at a distance even by their communities. There is also a legend about a father and a son who, while hunting, came upon two wolf pelts, they donned them and turned into wolves. They stalked the forest for several days, and at one point, father turned against son and they fought in wolf form. The son almost got killed and was only saved by the intervention of a benevolent raven that brought the father a few healing herbs, and with the help of those, the father managed to save his son, and eventually they burned the pelts so that nobody has to go through what they went through. This pretty much covers what I believe to be some of the more interesting werewolf related stories from the Norse mythology. Of course, there are many more, but in the time I spent researching this, these were the most fascinating I came across. Seeing how they might be easily integrated in Dungeons and Dragons, because Ulfhednar are related to berserkers, and we already have the berserkers in Dungeons and Dragons and many other TTRPGs. Now, I think it's only fair that we mention Asia, because there are some human-animal hybrids there too. In most of Asia, the usual culprit is a creature that is a hybrid between a tiger and a human, so were-tigers, while in Japan the animal was a fox, so we have were-foxes. But to be honest, I didn't find a lot of legends from Asia, but I promise I will continue my research, and once I find something interesting, I'm gonna come back to you with an updated version of this video. But until then, let us move even closer to our timeline and identify the moment where werewolf was first used in English. That happened in the 11th century. With the middle of the Middle Ages, besides the wave of witch hunts, we also have a similarly brutal wave of werewolf hunts here in Europe. People started actively hunting werewolves. Signs of being a werewolf were as follows: having a unibrow, having curved fingernails, having lower than normal ears, whatever that means, and walking similarly to a wolf. Again, I have no idea what that means, but these were the four main signs that somebody was a werewolf. When it comes to testing if somebody was actually a werewolf, things get really dark, really fast, and just as a fair warning, things are going to get very, very graphic and shocking in my opinion. So, if you don't wanna hear these details, just skip ahead until we talk about the miniature and we start wrapping things up. If you continue, fair warning, things are going to get disturbing. One of the tests that proved somebody was or wasn't a werewolf was removing chunks of skin or of flesh and see if there was any fur underneath. Multiple samples were taken, random chunks of flesh cut off, just to make sure. In other parts of the world, people believed that werewolves, when in human form, had bristles under their tongues or under the skin of their tongues. As such, their tongues had to be cut out just to make sure. In other parts of the world, people were very convinced that werewolves were immune to fire and iron. As such, they burnt off parts of their victims just to make sure that they weren't actually werewolves. Or they used branding irons in very creative ways. I don't want to imagine what those poor bastards that had unibrows or walked funny or had lower than normal ears had to go through. These people were tortured and brutalized because they walked funny or they had unibrows. Now that we've established what the tests were, let us talk about 3 infamous cases of werewolves. The first case comes from 16th century Bedburg, Germany. Our culprit or victim was called Peter Stump. He lived between 1535 and 1589, and what we know about him is that he was a very well-off farmer, and Stump is actually a nickname, not his surname, and it comes from the fact that he was missing his left hand. This is a life-altering fact that will come into play very shortly. Records mention that starting with 1580, he became a widower with 2 children, a daughter 15 years old and a son age unknown. Now, as I mentioned at the start of this video, there were certain areas where people believed that an injury suffered as a werewolf would be reflected with no problems as a human. Well, if you don't know where this is going, let me shed some light. Around the area of Bedburg, a werewolf supposedly stalked the land. That particular werewolf was missing its left paw. The only person around with a missing left hand was poor Peter Stump. He was arrested and brought to trial. He was stretched on a rack and chunks of his flesh were removed in search of the fur. To make sure that he confessed to his sins and devious actions, his bones were crushed between stones. Of course, this made him confess immediately to everything. He confessed to practicing black magic from the age of 12 and confessed that he had been indeed a werewolf for the past 25 years. He confessed to the killing and consuming of both livestock and humans, 14 children and 2 pregnant women. To add a little bit more spice to his confession, he also confessed of having an incestuous relationship with his daughter and a distant relative. Both women were flayed and then strangled before his eyes. He was eventually decapitated. His head was placed on a torture wheel in the middle of the settlement with a depiction of a wolf next to it as a reminder to the whole community that werewolves were not tolerated and that the werewolf that stalked the land was finally caught and eliminated. Scholars believe that Peter Stump was the victim of religious purging. He was a recent Protestant convert, and he thus became a victim in an almost literal war between Catholics and Protestants. But I shouldn't be that surprised. Even to this day, there are people who, and I don't want to get religious or political, but there are people who still believe in evil spirits and in bad juju and in exorcism, and that people of other religions are devil spawns and so on and so forth. So I shouldn't be surprised when he was the victim of religious purging. let's move on to Hans the Werewolf. In 1651, a young 18-year-old Estonian was brought before a court of justice and put on trial for being a werewolf. He quickly confessed because, well, we have already established the methods of obtaining such confessions. He confessed to hunting for 2 years in the form of a wolf. He told the court that one day he was given a wolf pelt by a man dressed in black, and upon donning that wolf pelt he became a wolf and was very proficient in hunting. The court was shocked and they came to the conclusion that this was a magical transformation. So, besides being a werewolf, he also practiced witchcraft. The court was also very convinced that the man dressed in black that gifted wolf pelt to Hans was actually the devil, so an additional accusation was brought against Hans, that of dealing with the devil. Given the accusations and his confession, he was very quickly executed. The last trial we'll be talking about comes with such a surprising twist that I guarantee you won't see coming. In 1692, in Denmark, an 8-year-old man named Deea was brought before a court and accused of being a werewolf. He immediately and proudly confessed to being one. He also stated firmly that this gift was sent by God and that 3 times per year he and his pack of werewolves, at God's orders, descended into the bowels of hell and battled Lucifer's demon legions. They did this because they were part of God's war against hell and to ensure a good harvest. The court tried to obtain a confession of practicing witchcraft and striking a deal with the devil, but Deea was adamant and stood firm behind his statement. His gift was from God and he battled devils. He wouldn't reveal the names of the other werewolves, and eventually he was sentenced to public whipping in October 1692. Now that we're done with these 3 trials, let's move even closer to our time, to the 19th century, when a new trend, a new legend was born, that of revenants. Revenants are werewolves that were improperly killed and came back as undead werewolves that feed on the blood of the living. So they are a werewolf vampire zombie combo. We have to be honest, the human imagination is insane and amazing. During the day, these revenants would be vampire zombies, while at night they would be werewolf vampire zombies. The best way to get rid of them would be to decapitate them with a spade, throw their heads into a river, and burn their bodies. Or simply treat them like average vampires, use silver, use garlic and sticks against them. And wow. Okay, let's take one more look at the miniature before we wrap things up. Apparently, this whole video revolves around the shawl the hag is wearing. This is the 3rd time I'm talking about it. Using Flash Git Yellow, I'm trying to add some more highlights. To be honest, I find yellow to be the most difficult paint to work with immediately after orange. That's why I plan on using it more until I master it. It's difficult to give minis the proper coverage and the perfect highlights, or as perfect as I can apply them. Eventually, I will be happy with how it looks, but I'm still far from that moment. Let's start wrapping things up. One of the reasons people came up with the idea of werewolves was because wolves in prehistory, in antiquity and in medieval times were a huge threat to livestock and to travelers from time to time, but usually wolves are afraid of humans. It takes special conditions and perhaps even rabies, for wolves to actually attack humans. But nonetheless, wolves sparked the imagination of humans and haunted their nightmares. Another reason, especially when it comes to ancient Greeks and Romans, was the shock and the barbarism of cannibalism. For them, only individuals who were so barbaric, so primitive, or people who were so sinful that the gods intervened and actively punished them were capable of cannibalism. They had to come up with a creature so shockingly brutal as to match the act of cannibalism. Another culprit was most likely rabies, as I mentioned in my previous video regarding vampires. Link is over there. People infected with rabies act like wild animals. They lunge at those around them, they try to attack them, they try to bite them, and being a disease that spreads through bites and scratches, it is a very nightmarish scenario for human beings, even to this day. If one gets infected with rabies, the chances of survival are almost none, and most likely they would spread it. Imagine this in prehistory, antiquity, and medieval period, when people couldn't even explain why this was happening. For them, this was a case of somebody becoming a werewolf. Another very likely culprit is lycanthropy. Lycanthropy is a very rare psychiatric disorder that makes the person afflicted believe that they can turn into or already have turned into a wolf. The general term for this disorder is zoanthropy. Nowadays, the term werewolf and lycanthrope are misused. They are interchanged, but they are not the same thing. On one hand, you have werewolf, that means a person that changes into a wolf, and on the other hand, you have lycanthrope, somebody who believes they can change into a wolf. Another likely culprit for the creation of werewolves is a condition called hypertrichosis. Hypertrichosis is a condition that manifests itself through excessive hair growth, leading to the person actually looking like a werewolf. You have an example below. Another explanation would be people with the Down syndrome. I don't know how this might spark the creation of werewolves, but there are some theories. I can't say I subscribe to this one, but I don't know enough to say that it's not true. Another explanation that I tend to believe is the attempt of understanding and explaining the presence of serial killers in communities. Trying to explain why people were brutally murdered could be a very difficult thing, and as such, people came up with monsters that were capable of doing such a thing, being unable to believe or unwilling to believe that somebody in their community was capable of such a thing. One final explanation could be bandits and highwaymen who perhaps donned wolf pelts. In certain parts of the world, including in Romania, in medieval times, highwaymen or exiles were called wolf heads. Perhaps this is one of the origins of werewolves. And before we go, I want to list a few of the werewolves one might encounter in fantasy nowadays. First, if you're a fan of Critical Role, we have Chutney in Campaign 3, who, although bitten, is able to turn into a werewolf, but I hope I'm not spoiling anybody. There are moments when he loses control, but he keeps his sanity, his identity, his personality, his abilities, and gains new ones. Then we have Professor Lupin in Harry Potter. He turns into a werewolf and loses complete control under the full moon, and he does not remember anything of what happened while he was a werewolf. Any injuries sustained while in werewolf form are present while in human form. Then we have Jake from Twilight, who can turn into a great wolf at will. He gains telepathy and enough strength and agility to take down ancient vampires. Of course, you also have werewolves in games such as World of Warcraft, and you have a lot of werewolves in movies. Werewolves have found a very cushy place in pop culture and in modern day fantasy creations, and I'm sure they can find a place in your own fantasy creation. And with that, I believe we have reached the end of our story regarding werewolves. Next time we'll be talking about ghouls, so make sure you tune in. In the meanwhile, make sure you check out my previous videos on vampires, bards, light sources, pigments, or even ancient roads. Oh, and make sure that the like button is highlighted before you go. And with that, thank you so much for the privilege of your time. I truly hope that you found the inspiration today and learned something new, and I can't wait to see you all here next week on Funky Monkey MP, the place where you get your weekly dose of miniature painting, history, and world building. Have yourselves a wonderful, wonderful day. Cheers!